Hey everybody, Tim Albrick here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week I welcome pharmacist and two-time author Dr. Helen Sairany to talk about how we can all heal together by transforming our trauma to triumph. During the interview, we discuss how her personal experience with complex PTSD and trauma has influenced her advocacy work in trauma-informed care, how her travels to over 100 countries has influenced her understanding of human resilience, her career transitions from working in Iraq as a new grad to association management to leading 2 state pharmacy associations and now running her own business, as well as the intersection of psychology and money and how our past traumas and belief systems play out in our spending behaviors. Before we jump into today's episode, I invite you to learn more and register for our next YFP webinar, Retirement Income Planning: How Much is Enough and How to Pay Yourself in Retirement. Saving for retirement and ensuring there's enough to retire comfortably is a good starting point, but it's important to then consider how a monthly paycheck will be generated during retirement to replace your pharmacist income. During this free YFP webinar, co-founder and director of financial planning, Tim Baker, will walk through strategies to build a retirement paycheck, including doing a live nest egg calculation, discussing savings vehicles, strategies for withdrawal, tax considerations, and how to consider and evaluate Social Security benefits. Make sure to attend live for a chance to win an Amazon gift card. If you can't make it live, no problem. Make sure to register and we'll send you a copy of the replay afterwards. You can learn more and register at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement. All right, let's jump into my interview with Dr. Helen Sairany. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. Looking forward to having a discussion with you today.
Me too. This has been a while in the making. You and I have known each other for a while now, at least a decade, I think.
Oh,
And
more than a decade. Yeah, for sure.
we crossed paths at the time you were working at the American Pharmacists Association. We'll talk more about your career journey as we get into the recording. And more recently, I feel like we've connected on our own healing journeys and some of the work that we've been doing individually. I have a ton of respect for the work that you have done. We'll talk about the books that you've written on this important topic of trauma. And I think for our listeners, it will be a real treat and perhaps a different angle and topic than they're used to as we dig into the finances normally. So thank you so much for taking time to join.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with your first book, Trading Grenades for Candy, one that I enjoyed. I remember reading it on vacation. I was at the Finger Lakes with my family. I couldn't put it down. True story. I already told Helen that. I'm not making it up for the show. And in that book, you share how, as a 7-year-old Kurdish child in Iraq, you were spotted by a U.S. Marine with a grenade in your hand who saved your life by exchanging the grenade for a bag of candy. And I want to start there. If you could tell us more about this early experience and how growing up in a violent background in a war-torn country led to your own trauma, which would eventually become the basis for helping others along in their own journey.
Yeah. And truth to be told, I don't have a recollection of that story because my trauma was so big and that I don't remember. So my parents actually, when I wrote my memoir, my parents told me how excited I was to rush home with that bag of candy, and I narrated the story to them then when I was 7. But I just don't remember that it happened. But the book, it's the title is "Trading Grenades for Candy," but it's more of a metaphor how I gave up my life in an austere environment for the American dream. And I'm sure you've kind of picked on this as I was narrating my story, how I was trying as a young woman, single, professional with all these degrees, trying to go back to the Middle East after all these years of living in the States, and how I was resented because I was one of the very few lucky ones who had the opportunity to leave the Middle East while everybody else was stuck in the war zone. So trading grenades for candy is trading my life for the American dream more. But it did start with that exchange between me and the Marine. And yes, it did led to my service in helping frontline heroes. Is it the Marines? Is it the pharmacists? Is it doctors? I feel like we all have a bit of trauma of some sort. But the book, if you look at the acknowledgement, the book is dedicated to the unknown Marine that saved my life, and I'm hoping that through this book I'll be able to find him one of these days. But it is a true story. It revolves around my life, around immigration, settlement, displacement, discrimination, and how I was resented at the end after returning to my roots.
Since we're going to talk a lot about trauma, if you could define that for us, I recently read, per your recommendation, Dr. Gabriel Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. Fantastic read. We'll link to that in the show notes. I think half my reading list, by the way, right now. I have a stack of books in my office. I think those are recommendations from you. So that one, he talks in that book about little T trauma, big T trauma, and just the way he taught that, and really, I think, helped me normalize in my own healing journey what that word even means, and
Mhm.
perhaps the misconceptions I had around trauma is important. But since we're going to talk so much about that, let's define that for a moment. How do you define trauma?
So I don't like the whole concept of big T, little T, and because the depth of human experience cannot be limited to a letter. Okay, your little t might be a big T for me, my big T
Mm,
might be a little t, while the society try to impose this whole concept of we're all created equal. But let's face it, some of us are more equal than others, and by that I mean some of us are more resilient than others. And if you look at the study that was done by JAMA, looking at the veterans who get deployed to combat, those 20% of veterans who come back, get clinically diagnosed with PTSD, are the ones with pre existing traumatic childhood experiences.
mhm,
So that is partly why I have a little bit of a concern with the big T and the little t category for trauma. So, what I like to define trauma as it's an event that is too much, that is too fast, and that is too soon for your brain to
mm,
comprehend. And
mhm,
that's why trauma is never about the brain challenges, while the mental health community likes to focus on mental health being as a separate brain, being a separate compartment than the body. Trauma, because it's too much, too fast, too soon, it gets stored in the body. It gets stored in the body, and that's why when you come across a trigger that is reminiscent of your past, it's usually the gut that tells you something is not okay, because the gut is connected to the brain stem, and
mhm.
brain stem, or the reptilian brain, is responsible for your survival. So again, trauma is, it's about something that happened inside of you because of what happened to you, but it's also about a disease that being stored in your body as a response to an event that was too much, too fast, too soon.
Yeah, one of the indicators I have found in my own journey is when I find myself having a disproportionate, I'm not sure if this is a technical term, but a disproportionate emotional reaction to a situation where I can step back and look at it and say, oh, wow, that was interesting. Like this happened and I got really angry, right? Or I became really sad, or I was really fearful, or feelings of shame or guilt or whatever is the emotion. And when I see that, wow, that event doesn't really correspond to the level of feeling that I was having. Just
Mhm.
being aware of that, I start to get curious about like, oh, that's interesting. What's going on there? Like, what is the trigger? What's the event? And I think for me, and I'd love for you to speak about this in your own journey with others, just that openness to curiosity,
Yes.
without judgment, feels to be a really important first step.
And I wish, Tim, and I'm so glad you brought this up. I wish as a profession, as in the whole healthcare field as a whole, would take that curiosity
Mm,
approach, because it is no coincidence that 1 out of every 2 American is reporting either anxiety or depression. It is no coincidence that 60% of Americans are reporting at least one chronic disease.
mm,
So now you can blame genetics all you want, but that is a hard case for me to roll with, because genetics cannot alter at such a fast pace. So the typical North American provider reaction is, well, what are we going to do? Like, well, as a healthcare provider, if the same patient, and that's what led to the whole famous adverse childhood experiences study by doctors Bob Anda and Vince Felitti, they kept seeing patient with morbid obesity, one patient after the other, and the same different patient would report the same exact adversity from childhood. And that is what led to the birth of adverse childhood experiences study, that perhaps obesity is not about the food, but it's more
mm,
a reaction to
mhm,
early adversity from childhood. So that's the curiosity that you and I are talking about. Let's take a step back and figure out, how did we get here, because the
mm,
profession is not okay, healthcare is not okay. I mean, I don't like to focus just on pharmacists. I was recently on a sabbatical, and I ran across a half a dozen nurses from the US, and some of them were saying that they wake up to the beats of the sound of the IV unit from the ICU. And that
Mm.
is an iconic symptom of PTSD. So the curiosity, I think it's overdue. And I think because of the scary statistics, I don't think we are in a situation where we can have a reactionary response anymore. I think we have no choice but to take a step back and figure out how did we get here? What is an issue in the system that is causing so much disease and so much dysfunction among all of us?
And I'm curious, as you speak to groups all across the country, groups of pharmacists, groups of other healthcare professionals, but for our audience, as we think of pharmacists that are listening, I'm not sure they would associate, the word trauma with their experience in the healthcare system or their role. Like what type of responses are you getting from pharmacists? What types of thoughts or feelings or reactions are coming up, and where is that stemming from?
So I wrote an article for Pharmacy Times 2021, 3 years ago, 3 years ago. And I talked about, we were still like in Omicron era. And
Hmm.
I talked about how what pharmacists are going through is equivalent to what a combat veteran would go through. Okay, so
Hmm.
pharmacists are experiencing um, combat like trauma, excuse me. And the article just went viral. I wasn't expecting for anybody to kind of associate combat trauma to burnout. I just randomly wrote the articles. You know me, I'm passionate about trauma, and the article went viral. And so many pharmacists wrote me and they said, this is what I was feeling this whole time, but I just didn't know how to categorize it. Do you know what I mean? And they thanked me for it. And as you're aware, I've gone to 26, 27 states, and I gave one keynote, and my keynote went viral. And
Hmm.
I just been giving the same talk about how what institutions or what pharmacists in institutions are going through is equivalent to combat trauma. So if that is the case, if we are coming out of our workplace with combat like trauma, does that mean our workplace is a combat zone? And that is a question that I address the audience because um, individuals who go to combat, veterans who go to combat, they come back with PTSD. But if we are ending up with combat like trauma from our workplace, that means our workplace is not healthy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and when you talked about the example of nurses you interacted with when you were on sabbatical, and that one example of hearing the beat of the IV, like are there similar examples and trends or similarities you're hearing among pharmacists? And is it in community practice? Is it in hospital practice? Is it across the board? But what are some of those experiences that pharmacists are having as a result of this traumatic workforce, this traumatic experience?
And I know you and I kind of talked about this in our earlier conversations. I like, as much as I hate to and I'm not trying to belittle workplace, but
Hmm.
I think the number one concern for pharmacists is the lack of fulfillment. The lack of fulfillment. I can only talk on my behalf. I went through pharmacy school. I got a doctoral degree, and for 4 years, I was told I'm a provider. I'm a provider, and I was taking all these amazing therapeutic courses, and I was so excited. And then, as soon as I was out of pharmacy school, I got hit.
Hmm.
I was not a provider. Now we have a provider status bill that I cannot get reimbursed for my services, and I cannot use 90% of the
Yeah.
clinical therapeutics that I was taught. So now what do I deal with? And I'm not saying that I was misled, and I'm not going to say that I was lied to, but it is a shock going back to too much, too fast, too soon, too much. You are actually put, and that is what the examples I hear from pharmacists. They feel like after pharmacy school, they're being put in a heavy traffic during
Hmm.
rush hour, and they're told to guide the traffic with no prior experience.
Hmm.
Now, that is not traumatic. I don't know what it is.
Hmm.
It is too much. And they're trying to kind of figure out, and then the clock is ticking with the workload. So I would say this is the example that I've been hearing: the lack of fulfillment, and also they're not doing something that they were told they were, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that lack of fulfillment and the misaligned expectations, I think for those that have been working for a period of time and have experienced any of that, there's a mental exhaustion. We talk about burnout. We use different words for this, but over a long enough period of time, I think we can really underestimate the impact that it can have. And certainly, I think the human can be very resilient to short term stress, and that's to be expected on
Yeah.
some level, regardless of workplace. But what I hear from pharmacists is that misaligned expectations,
Yes.
that lack of ability to do the work that they thought they were going to do or to have the impact that they thought they were going to have. Obviously, we talk about the financial impact and, feeling like they're tied to that setting, whether it's a good fit or not because of their debt, because
Mhm.
of other things. But you layer that on in the example given of the feeling of like you're in the middle of rush hour traffic
Oh, yeah.
and you're expected to guide this traffic over a 12-hour shift and another 12-hour shift and another 12-hour shift
Yeah.
over
Every
many, many
day.
years. I mean,
Mhm.
you can start to appreciate the level of impact that would be there.
Exactly.
Helen, you have been open in sharing your own journey with complex PTSD that you were diagnosed with in 2013. And I'm
Mhm.
curious to hear how that personal experience with trauma has influenced your advocacy and your work towards trauma informed care.
So I've had PTSD all my life, but I just didn't know that it was PTSD. Just like how pharmacists were telling me in that article, like they knew it was trauma, they knew it was too much, too fast, too soon, but they didn't know how to kind of point fingers at it. So it wasn't until I was back from overseas and that unfortunate encounter because I was treating little girls with PTSD when I was part of Doctors Without
Mhm.
Borders, and that is when my inner child started going out of control and I would wake up sweating with nightmares and so that's when I realized that something was not okay. So I was diagnosed, but unfortunately the diagnosis and the way it's being handled, and I've been very critical about it, it turns you to a victim to a label, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Mhm.
And I carried a lot of stigma, I carried a lot of shame back in 2013, and I didn't go public about my symptoms until COVID-19. And COVID-19, as much as I hate what happened, it was more of like an awakening for me, that I need to, because I wasn't able to travel. I'm a world traveler. So all my
Mhm.
travel got canceled and we were all stuck at home. So that is when I realized that I could do something good about this. So I wrote my first book, Trading Grenades for Candy. Trading Grenades for Candy is what led people to ask for more because I don't deep dive into the mental health aspect of my traumatic past. So I would say it was my memoir that led me to do all this great work. And as I started deep diving into trauma, Tim, I realized that it's very relevant for what the healthcare is going through.
Yeah.
It's too
Yeah.
much, it's too fast, too soon. And I'm quick. Like I started relating to what physicians are going through, what pharmacists are going through, what nurses are going through. So it's not limited to war. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think just that reframe, the acceptance of that and understanding
Yeah.
the definition of trauma. And I know we talked about whether little t and big T is appropriate, but I speaking for myself, often when I think back to my childhood and just the admiration, respect, and love that I have for my parents and the experiences,
Mhm.
I kind of put a wall up to like, well, there was no trauma. I didn't experience any of the big T, right? The things that I think about or I have the
Mhm. Yeah.
understanding about. And so I think that that can sometimes cloud our
Mhm.
understanding and awareness of, if we can humble ourselves for a minute, even as I think about raising my own four boys, like they have experienced trauma, like in my household that has happened, not big T trauma, but there is traumatic experience that happen in any household that are going to have an impact on them
Yeah.
as they think about long term.
Exactly.
You said inner child. I think that's a term that I know has been important to me in my own journey, as I've worked with a men's group and gone through some counseling as well. Can you define that for those that aren't familiar with that term?
So inner child is basically it's the child that gets suspended inside of you. And for example, my mother was emotionally distant, so I didn't grow up with Barbies and toys and like a typical American child, right? Not because they didn't want me to, because we were in a war zone, right?
Mhm.
When you're about to be bombed, like survival is the number one priority. But that child has healthy narcissistic needs. So we're not talking about the narcissism such as the narcissistic boss or the ex, right?
Mhm.
We're talking about a child feeling like needing the unconditional love, being inconvenient, regardless of how sleepy or how tired you are. They want to play, they want that attention.
Yes.
That is the healthy narcissistic need. But if you are distracted, or if you're burnt out, or if you're stressed, you're not going to be able to give that child what the child needs. So, what happens, the child is going to have a tough decision to make. Am I going to force my authenticity, my need from my parents for the attachment, or am I gonna split from my authentic need? chances are, because they put you on a pedestal, because my parents are never wrong, they are going to start what's called splitting. They're going
Mm,
to suspend that inner child need, the healthy narcissistic need. But whatever is not met, it gets suspended, which
mhm.
means they take their unmet needs to their adult life, and their unmet needs becomes the boss's need, it becomes the partner's need, it becomes whatever. So kudos to those who kind of know the term, who know where this inner child need comes from. But a lot of people, they let their inner child bleed all over them, and they're not aware of it.
That's a beautiful, succinct explanation. Thank you. I have a guy in my men's group, Greg, who does a lot of this area of work and talks a lot about the inner child. And he does a beautiful job of naming little Greg
Yeah,
and the work that he has to do to spend time with little Greg and nurture little Greg and, reinvigorate some of those experiences and things
right.
that we're missing. And it's just beautiful to watch kind of that journey and understanding of
Yeah.
the inner child and the impact that it can have. You mentioned travel a
Yes.
couple times on the podcast. You've traveled to over 100 countries, which is incredible. I feel like every time I see what you're up to on LinkedIn, you're in a new country, doing new and different things. How have these experiences enriched your experience of human resilience and even the work that you're doing around trauma informed care?
It shows how we humans have so much in common. My goodness, so much in
Mm,
common. And I grew up, and I know you've read my memoir. I've grew up struggling with belonging. I was always a refugee girl in the States who spoke with an accent, with thick brows, curly hair. She's different, right? And I knew it was different. I knew I didn't belong in the States. I knew I was a foreigner. But the reality hit was when I decided to go back and serve with Doctors Without Borders. And when I got the resentment from my own people, they're like, well, you're the American wannabe.
mm,
So I felt like I was the foreigner in the States, and now I was the American wannabe in my own mother country. So it became very difficult. And I was going through an identity crisis in my late 20s. And only then my therapist was like, well, says who, that you have to decide between either or. You're just a world citizen, right? So I would say my lack of belonging, whenever I feel that pain that I don't belong anywhere, I feel like I belong everywhere. And I'm
mm.
not trying to be Maya Angelou here, but it really is true, because this lack of fulfillment, it just made me want to belong everywhere. And I just love, every time I am stressed or I'm depressed or I'm having difficulties, I just go and plant somewhere, and I come back completely
Mm.
refreshed. Yeah.
When I think of your career journey, Helen, it's an interesting, non-traditional. I'm not even sure that's the best term.
Yeah.
You've talked about your experience shortly after graduating Doctors Without Borders. You spent several years at the American Pharmacists Association doing some incredible work there, where our paths crossed. You then would go on to lead a couple state pharmacy associations. Now you're doing the work that we're talking about here on this episode, and dabbling into the world of entrepreneurship and all the exciting things that are there. One of the things I see pharmacists really struggle with is the attachment to their identity as their role of being a pharmacist. And when different opportunities might open up that are quote non-traditional. I remember feeling this when I came out of residency and I quickly exited practice and was exploring different things in academia. I had this little voice in the back of my head that was like, well, Tim, didn't you train for 8 years and take
Mm.
on all this debt and go through residency? Like, you're a clinic, you should be a clinician. And I remember thinking, like, I don't really like clinical practice. Like, it's just not for me. And it took some time to really accept that and really see where I could have an impact and align with my skills in other areas. And so my question for you, as you think about your journey, your identity as a pharmacist, your role as a pharmacist, how have you worked through that? Has that been a challenge as you've gone through this own journey, and you're now doing work, obviously, in trauma and helping other healthcare professionals?
So I knew I knew when I was a student intern that I was more than what was allowed of me.
Hmm.
And the disappointment started early on. And that, I believe that's probably why I packed my stuff and I joined Doctors Without Borders. So the whole, we talked about the whole concept. Well, I felt like maybe I was misled, or maybe I was not being told. I picked that up really quickly, and not
Hmm.
being in growing up in a traumatic environment. I tend to be a bit quicker than an average person. because of the risk I was surrounded by, I had no choice but to be quick in connecting dots. So I would say I am a bit faster than an average individual because of my unfortunate circumstances. So I was quick in picking up that if I take this path, I know Helen is not going to thrive. So that's probably why I decided to take this non-traditional pathway. But I would never ever associate my identity with my profession. And I know that's not a typical response you hear, but I would like to emphasize one thing, Tim, and that is something I would say 99% of pharmacists don't know. And it just came up yesterday as I was talking to a mentor of mine. Every 7 years, it's a new you.
Mm,
Every 7 years, every cell of your body goes through a complete rebirth. So that's exactly what happened to me with APHA. After 7 years, that is when it hit. Because I felt like I was going up, 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 and I was doing all these amazing things. And then I reached the status quo. And I talk to a lot of people, it's usually the 7 year that hits them
mm,
because
hmm.
the body goes through a complete reform. So it's not about feeling guilty, it's not about abandoning the profession. This is how we're built as a human, if that makes sense. Some people are more open to it, while other people, because of the societal conditioning, the professional conditioning, they decide to just stay where they are just because this is something they feel like that they signed up for.
Yeah, and that's the piece I see a lot, Helen, what you just mentioned there, the openness to it or lack thereof. I see this on the financial side where there's, a very real sunk cost concept where I put X amount into, or maybe my family help, my parents help, whoever, into paying for this college degree. I remember when I graduated in 2008, the story was very strong, said and unsaid, of like, you will be a doctor, you will
Yeah,
practice at the top of your license, right? All the things that you shared early on. And I think there's a real risk of the enmeshment that can happen between
exactly.
your individual identity, which is independent of your role as a pharmacist. But very quickly, I think when we take ourselves back to 18, 19, 20-year old Tim going through pharmacy school, like those things start to become enmeshed. But if we're not careful, I think some of that may not separate back out. And what I run into is people that I can sense have the intuition, whether it's 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, 5 years, whatever, but aren't willing to pivot, move, or be open to what else may be out there within or outside of the profession for
Yeah.
a variety of different reasons.
No, I hear you. And that is the whole concept of the codependent society, which something I'm sure you came across in my second book. It's
Hmm.
enmeshment, right? Like I will feel good if XYZ feels good about me. And it's, if you look at our academic system, and I know you've written about this as well, they turn our identity to a letter.
Yeah.
And if the letter is F, I feel like a failure.
Yes.
If the letter is A, I feel, but, and I know the whole concept of Maria Montessori, she challenges the whole Western
Yeah.
academic system because it's all about play and this whole concept of ADHD, which we can go on and on.
Hmm.
And Dr. Gabor actually challenges, is the child fighting ADHD or is the child fighting this dry, classroom setting, because kids are meant to play, they're meant to be playful, and that's what Dr. Maria Montessori focuses on. But you're expecting the child to sit on their butt like this for 8 hours, of course they're going to be diagnosed with
Yeah.
ADHD. So it's time for us to revisit some of these concepts and some of these associations, but until then people are going to continue associating themselves with these labels.
Yeah, and I think the labels, as a parent of four young boys, right? That's a
Yeah,
concern that I have is, do those labels get imprinted early? Where do those stories come from? And, my wife and I have been talking a lot recently, and one of our boys in particular, where we caught ourselves recently
yeah,
recognizing that, hey, we've kind of told ourselves and each other a story
yeah,
about what he essentially did something. He was trying out for a sport, and it was something we both looked at. We're like, oh, we're surprised. Like he self-initiated, and we're glad we kind of gave him the space to do it. But we caught ourselves in the moment of like, wait a minute, like why are we both saying we're surprised by this? And then it led to a conversation of, hey, we've kind of both told ourselves this story
yeah,
of who he is and what he should be doing, while he's very clearly trying to tell us, like, that's not his story. That's not what he
exactly.
thinks. And so it's really interesting to watch and observe that. And even to see my boys in their creative habitat and environment is, to be outside, to figure it out, to be creative, to work through the messiness. And I think so much to be learned there, which we can't necessarily measure, and say that's an A, B, or a C.
And
Um,
to add to that, and that's partly why I've been a little critical. I can say this because I'm a member of minority. Okay, so this has nothing to do with Tim for disclosure. I've been a little critical of DEI because it just I'm going to keep emphasizing, is it trauma? Is it diversity? Is it equity? Is it inclusion? Whatever it is, it's about the depth of human experience.
mm,
The second you associate it with label, big T, little t, microaggression,
hmm
macroaggression, like all these labels going around, that's when you confuse me. You confuse me. And labels separate us, and labels confuse us,
mm,
and labels get us in trouble. Because the
hmm
second you mess up and label, what do people do? They associate you with XYZ and they cancel you. So it is a concerning era in this country because of this whole concept of labels. And that's partly why I have issues with labels,
hmm
because after all, why do I travel all around the world? Because I feel like we all have so much in common,
Yeah.
and labels just never help, if that makes
hmm
sense, with coexistence.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. That's great. I
Yeah.
want to talk for a moment about a topic we could do a whole separate episode on, which is boundaries and setting boundaries, something that I don't think we as pharmacists are inherently comfortable with. I recognize I'm generalizing that when I say that. I remember reading Dr. Henry Cloud's book on boundaries several years ago, and it was just very eye-opening of, whoa, like I'm
Yeah.
not very good at setting boundaries. And, that could be boundaries with ourselves, that could be boundaries
Yeah.
with loved ones, boundaries with coworkers. But what are you seeing in terms of pharmacists' lack thereof of boundaries, and why setting boundaries is so important?
I mean, I think so. That's something you could relate to, Tim, more than I do. It's asking for reimbursement. It's the biggest.
Mm,
It's the biggest boundary. Um, Find me a provider that's going to do MTM for 40 minutes for free.
hmm
I mean, that has been our biggest, I don't want to call it an enemy, but it's backlashing. It's backlashing. And the expectation is, and I know you and I kind of talked about this, the expectation is, well, if I don't get reimbursed for my services, when a colleague of mine who has a specialty, a consulting service, it becomes an expectation that I shouldn't pay either. It's more of like reenacting our trauma, if that makes sense. So I would say the biggest boundary is basically we've allowed our service to go by unrecognized.
Yeah.
And this is not about provider status. You ask a nurse, you ask a physician, they will all tell you pharmacists are provider. This is about a change in the regulatory language. This is about payment parity. So I'd like to, and I've challenged APHA, I've challenged Tom Minigan myself. Provider status has put a lot of insecurity in all of us because we all
Yes.
thought we were providers, and now there is a bill. So put insecurity in us all, and there's still no payment parity. So it's the payment parity that we need. So going back to
Mhm.
the whole boundary concept, I would say that's the biggest in the profession, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back to unrecognized value. It goes back to that feeling like I was trained to do something
Hmm.
more and have a bigger contribution, but I have limits. And I remember, I graduated in 2008. And, when you think about what was supposed to be big news with 2006 Medicare Part D,
Hmm.
MTM, I remember the rollout of Medicaid MTM in Ohio,
Yeah.
2009, 2010, huge, huge opportunity. I remember the early pushes for provider status. I know
Hmm.
some that are listening are saying, yeah, we talked about this back with pharmaceutical care, and I get it, but I feel like the closest we probably were. And even then, it felt like we're dancing around, like, are we tactically doing this the right way, and are we asking for too much, and do we need another pilot study to validate this, and
Exactly.
yada yada yada. So it's a really interesting take on boundaries, and even some trauma related to that within our own
Oh
profession.
my God,
But,
yes.
and the
Yeah.
cumulative head trash
Yeah.
that has probably come from, you're absolutely right. When we insert this language of we need to achieve provider status, despite other healthcare professionals thinking of us in that way, it almost sets the expectation back on ourselves of, oh, well, I'm not a provider yet. I need to advocate for that and fight for that.
Yeah. I mean, I have so many physician friends. They're like, what are you talking about? You are a provider.
Right.
So they're
Right.
like trying, like, Helen, you're okay. You're okay. I'm like,
You're like, but we don't get paid.
we
Yeah.
don't get paid. Yes. Yes.
I want to shift gears and talk about the psychology of money. I think related to the conversation, certainly one of interest from our audience. You shared with me a couple weeks ago. I think you're taking a course and some training through
Yes.
some business coaching classes that you're doing. But as it relates to the psychology of money, how fascinating
Mhm.
it is for how our past traumas and belief systems play out and our spending habits and our financial behaviors. Tell us more about what you're learning there.
So, time and time again, I hear money is the number one stressor for couples. In laws are the number one stressors for couples. Communication is the number one stressor for couples. And the number three reasons for successful relationships. We hear all that, right? It's all symptoms. All that you
Mm,
hear is symptoms of childhood baggage. What baggage, what belief system do you bring into the relationship? Okay. Now, for someone like me, I grew up in an environment that was defined by scarcity,
yeah.
defined by scarcity. And my family, when I visit them, I've gotten out and about. I explored the world. I've kind of invested in myself, so I feel like I've kind of opened up a bit. But when I go back, I still see the scarcity, that
Mm,
money's going to run out, that resources are going to run out. And because that's how we grew up in an economic sanction. We grew
mhm.
up in an economic sanction, and what is not being addressed, just like the inner child, you bring it to your adult relationships, adult life. And it's not the money that triggers conflict. It's more the money is being as a symptom. It's a symptom of a belief that you've inherited from the environment that your family exposed you to, so my take is that whatever it is, it's time for you to reflect, going back to the curiosity that
Mhm.
you started the podcast with. What is making you feel that you don't want to spend XYZ? And it's always catching the triggers, like what is the trigger coming from? Why are you feeling
Yes.
the way you're feeling? And I feel like that has helped me because I journal a lot, and I write down, and I try to trace it back to the scarcity environment that I was
Mhm.
exposed to. So money is a belief system, but the belief system, it's rooted back to your childhood upbringing, I would say.
And this is a huge gap in the financial planning process.
Mhm.
And a shout out to our team that I think really does a nice job of trying to dig a little bit deeper here because any financial decision we're making, right? The X's and O's when it comes to
Yeah.
investing or debt management or whatever, all those are important. But underneath it, there lies this story and narrative
Oh
of
my God, yes.
how we view money and our beliefs around it. Some of the money psychologists call this the money scripts or the money classrooms that we grew up in. And you see this a lot with partners or spouses where, back to my earlier example of a disproportionate emotional reaction, like
Yes.
if you find yourself in that and are able to get curious and reflect back of like, wow, my partner, my spouse just made a $10 purchase, 30, it doesn't matter what the number was. And it really felt much, much bigger or it evoked
Hmm.
feelings of scarcity or anger. Like what's behind that? And the more curious you can get individually and then collectively together, of course, for those that are in a relationship doing this together, I think the more fruit you're going to see in the outcome of that. But it's hard because if we're not doing the work to really
Hmm.
surface some of those things, we're going to constantly butt up against those challenges, often which
Exactly.
started. I always say, take yourself back to the kitchen table growing up. Like what were those conversations
Exactly.
or lack thereof potentially as
Exactly.
well?
And
Absolutely.
that is something that Dr. Gabor Mate talks about. Like, yes, your partner spent $10, it might trigger you, but you carry the ammunition.
Yes.
The trigger warrant that ammunition, that big
Mhm.
bomb, right? And where is that coming from?
Yes.
Do you know
Where
what I
does that
mean? So
come from?
it's a fascinating concept he talks about in his book. But I would say everything is rooted to childhood belief and the
Mhm.
scarcity that we all bring into any relationship. Is it work? Is it marriage? Is it whatever it
Mhm.
is?
Yeah, and for those that have kids under the house, there's the double challenge of doing the work looking back to understand where your own beliefs come from. And then there's the work realizing that you have a
Yeah.
whole nother generation that are developing money scripts, based
Yes.
on, whatever they're experiencing as well. I want to talk about Helen for a minute. If you're willing to share, what has your own healing journey looked like in terms of therapists that have been involved, support groups, the inner
Mhm.
work that you're doing, the daily habits that you have employed that you have found to be most helpful?
Um, so I would say Helen is work in progress, because there is no such thing as a healing for trauma. Trauma PTSD was not added to DSM-5, and I'm sure you know this, Tim. PTSD was the very first promise to treating trauma, and it wasn't added to DSM-5 until the 80s. So we still don't know enough. Like, my
Hmm.
definition of trauma is going to disagree with Dr. Gabor Mate. Dr. Gabor Mate is going to disagree with Bessel van
Yeah.
der Kolk, because we don't know enough. We don't know enough. Like, we kind of understand how trauma works. We know there's triggers involved. We know the inner child. We know the dysfunctionality. But I would say there is not a universal definition around
Hmm.
trauma. So going back to Helen, I would say I am definitely work in progress. There are days where I am good, and there are days where I am not so good. It all depends on the triggers that Helen comes across and what ammunition do I
Hmm.
have. That I carry within. There are days where the ammunition just gets out, and people are like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Your reaction was not warranted." And there are days where, like Helen, just yes.
Hmm.
So I would say I start off my day with no, it's non-negotiable. I start my day with meditation,
Hmm.
because the meditation, it doesn't matter if you're on a vacation, it doesn't matter if you're hanging out on a beach resort in Fiji, whatever. You meditation, it carries on, it regulates
Yeah.
your body's alarm system, right? So I highly recommend meditation for everybody first thing in the morning, because you are in an alpha state. Because if you do it middle of the day, it's going to take 20 minutes for you to calm your brain, because the waves kind of pick up, right? But when you first wake up in the morning, the waves are like slowly picking up.
Yeah.
And that is a golden opportunity for you to regulate that body's alarm system. And as you're aware, I'm a runner. So I run end of the day at sunsets.
Hmm.
And I try to read. Writing has been my go to. So I'm really glad I have a hobby that has been beneficial to people, but it's equally healing for myself.
So I hear writing in there, reading, exercising, meditation. It sounds like you've got a
And of
daily rhythm.
and of course, I'm not advocating anybody to be vegetarian or plant based, but I've invested a lot in my diet. So
Mm-hmm.
fitness is a priority for me, for sure.
Yeah, what I have found in my own, I've shared with you before. I think like the morning is sacred, protected time.
Hmm.
Partly, I think with the boys, once 8 o'clock hits and the day's kind of off and running, and I'm by nature a morning person, but having the rhythms of walking and meditation and some breath work and some
Hmm.
writing and reading really helps me set the definition for a day. And I have struggled with meditation. I have found some breath work to
Hmm.
be more impactful. But with both of those, I have found that even when I'm distracted in the moment, and I may not necessarily look at that 5, 10, or 15 minutes and say, hey, I really feel like I got a lot of it in that moment.
Hmm.
It's the trickle effect that happens throughout the day where I find myself just getting more curious and asking questions or being aware of some of the emotional triggers or reactions that are
Yeah.
coming up throughout the day, that I think that work really does help contribute to, as the day goes on.
And just if I may, one thing, Tim, meditation can be very triggering for some people,
Mm-hmm.
because it brings up a lot of thoughts, right? There are days where I'm just like a hot mess because of meditation. But again, that is called the grief work, that you've never taken a chance. Our society celebrates instant gratification. Well, if this relationship did not work, the only way you can get over him is to find someone else. But no, the only way to get over him is to do the grief work,
Mm.
you know. So meditation, it could be triggering for a pain work that you did not take a chance to grieve it, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. So I just want to kind of bring that up, because there are times where I haven't allowed myself to grieve a pain in
Yeah.
my life, and it surfaces during meditation, because
Mm-hmm.
it's you and yourself, and the most difficult relationship you could have is the one with yourself, not with the significant other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, really also speaks to the role of a therapist and making
Yes.
sure you're working with someone, that's qualified to help
Totally.
you work through that grief as well.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up by talking about your new certificate training program, Healing Together, Transforming Your Trauma to Triumph. We'll link to that in the show notes. Tell us more about what this training program includes, who it's for, and what you're trying to accomplish through this.
So we kind of talked about what inner work is, and how and I'd like to call it the childhood baggage, which happens to be the title of my third book. That childhood baggage shows up in your relationship with money. We now know that
Mhm.
that childhood baggage shows up in your relationship with your significant other, and guess what? That childhood baggage bleeds all over you in the workplace. Okay.
Mm.
So the corporate likes to think about how well we should function as if the human is going to shut off the emotion the second they walk into the office. I wish that was the case. I wish that was the case. But we're all interconnected. We're all interconnected, just like how a family. I'm sure you read the Bowen's family theory in my second book, how a family is interconnected like
Hmm.
this, right? And for the family to proceed, everybody has to do their role. But the second one member comes out, the whole interconnected unit gets disrupted. Let's
Yeah.
say dad is addicted to alcohol or gets imprisoned or
Mhm.
they go through divorce, whatever. There's so much adversities in life. So if one member is not able to continue, the whole interconnected unit gets disrupted, in which means someone else needs to pick up the role of
Mm.
the individual that got off of the system.
Mhm.
Same exact concept with work system. Work system is no different than family system. But what does the corporate do? The second an individual goes rogue, they treat that individual like a sacrificial lamb,
Yeah.
right? Cut the head off, and it's only a matter of time for that problem to surface again
Mhm.
and again and again. So we don't like to think, because thinking in hard is hard, excuse me, we like to judge.
Mhm.
We like to judge. So this whole certificate training program, it's about how the childhood baggage bleeds all over you. How
Mm.
many bosses are narcissists? Until you're like, well, you know what? Maybe I'm the common denominator here. How many
Mhm.
jobs, how many exes, how many, I don't know what. But this is not about work. This is not about bosses. This is about the inner work, because people don't quit jobs, people quit people. And we all
Mhm.
bring our own traumas, we all bring our own baggages into the workplace that makes a workplace that is already bad even worse. So it is about, looking at the workplace from a trauma lens and looking about how it is time for us to have a complete look at how people are functioning as if they're in a dysfunctional family system.
It's great work. And we will link to it in the show notes, your website, helensairany.com. From there, you'll find the certificate training program, all what's included in the modules as a part of that. Also, if you haven't already read one of two, as Helen mentioned, there's a third on its way book. But the first two books, Trading Grenades for Candy, The We You Don't See, both are available on Amazon. You can also find more information on Helen's website, which we'll link to in the show notes. Helen, this has been fantastic. As always, I appreciate your input, your perspective. I have a lot of admiration from your work. You have certainly taught me a lot, and I know that will be true of our community as well.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for having me.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.